If you've ever had a weird, annoying house guest who disrupts your household and refuses to leave, you have something in common with Victorian novelist Charles Dickens. If, on the other hand, you've ever been a chaotic house guest with attachment issues and a penchant for melodrama, then you have something in common with beloved fairy tale author Hans Christian Andersen. So, let's get the tea on the most dysfunctional holiday in literary history. We tend to assume that the fairy tales we grow up hearing are ancient, and most of them are. But some of them just feel ancient because they've become such a part of our own psyches, as well as touchstones of popular culture. It can surprise people that the ugly duckling, the princess and the pea, the little mermaid and Thumbelina are not part of a folkloric oral tradition, but were written by one person in the 19th century. A very dramatic, obsessive, and very weird Danish man called Hans Christian Andersen. I'm Heidi from the Obsession podcast, where we get horribly obsessed with weird stuff from the past. And today we're going to talk about the obsessive relationship history of Hans Christian Andersen. In particular, his friendship with Charles Dickens and the disastrous visit that ended the friendship. And today, my drawing is going to be inspired by one of the incredible pieces of paper cutting art that was done by Hans Christian Andersen that I had the pleasure of seeing at Goma in Brisbane earlier this year. There's a mythology surrounding Hans Christian Andersen that's made him this sweet, happy-go-lucky guy who's always surrounded by children, and that's mainly to do with the 1952 musical film that had almost nothing to do with the real Hans Christian Andersen. But did have some great songs and a very plucky performance by Danny Kaye in the title role. But a real movie about the actual Hans Christian Andersen wouldn't be a jaunty Hollywood musical. It would be more likely to be a really mopey, experimental 10-act opera with very dramatic arias, all done by Hans in the spotlight. His detractors, and he did have quite a few detractors in his day, described him as selfish, narcissistic, demanding, and a ruthless and snobby social climber. While his friends did find him to be a warm and loving person, they were often frightened away by his overwhelming neediness and the obsessive nature of his feelings for them. What often began as a delightful friendship often turned into something strange and oppressive. There are all sorts of cliches that come to mind immediately when you think about his life. Real life fairy tale, rags to riches, humble beginnings. All of these tired phrases could have been invented solely to describe Andersen's true story. He was born on the 2nd of April, 1805 in Odense, Denmark. His mother was a washerwoman. His father was a cobbler, and they lived in poverty in a one-bedroom cottage. He was very different to the other children in his neighborhood. He loved to read, and his main source of books was the single bookshelf above his father's workbench. He was fascinated by the local theatre and made puppets and sewed dolls' clothes. He was considered so effeminate by the local boys that there is a story that says that they tore his clothes off to make him prove that he wasn't really a girl. If this wasn't enough to make him an outcast, his grandfather was known for being mentally ill, and young Hans was taunted for being as mad as his grandfather. Although he did like to make up stories, the talent that stood out most was his glorious soprano voice. And for a long time, Hans thought that singing would be his ticket out of poverty. He was fearlessly confident when it came to his ability as a performer, and the wealthy families of Odense began to invite him to sing at their dinner parties. It was in these houses that the young Hans got glimpses of the life that he wanted for himself, and he was determined to be part of what he saw as a higher class of society. His father died when he was 11, and his mother made him take factory jobs and apprenticeships, and he always got kicked out of these apprenticeships within days. When his mother remarried, Hans, at the age of 14, decided that it was time to leave home. So, he went by himself to Copenhagen, a city where he knew no one, and immediately went to the Royal Theatre to ask for a job. Hans was tall, gawky, he was dressed like a peasant, so the director, of course, laughed and showed him the door. One by one, he sought out all of the bigwigs of the theatre world, and they all told him to get lost. That was until he happened upon the composer, Christopher Wise, who was so impressed with the talented teenager that he got him a place at the Royal Choir School and gave him a small scholarship that would enable him to house and feed himself, but only barely, while he studied. Poverty still dogged Hans, but he was able to study music and singing and even ballet. Then came the tragedy that befalls so many talented boy sopranos. His voice broke, and it was clear that his adult voice wasn't going to be anything special. So Hans thought about falling back on his plan B, which was to become a ballet dancer. Unfortunately, by this time he'd grown so tall and so gawky that this wouldn't be possible either. And that is when Hans was reminded of something else that he enjoyed doing, which was writing and making up stories. Through a series of fortunate events, Hans came into contact with the financial director of the Royal Theatre, Jonas Collins. Impressed by his scripts, Jonas Collin decided to become the patron of this odd-looking 17-year-old, and he got the King of Denmark, of all people, to provide funding for Hans to get the grammar school education that Collin decided that was needed if Hans was to become a writer. Now, this sounds great, but remember, Hans was 17 at the time, and the other boys were 13 and 14, so this was socially awkward in the extreme. So even though Hans was grateful for the opportunity, he also felt humiliated. It didn't help that the headmaster was a cruel and vicious man who hated creativity and imagination, and of course, Hans was everything that he despised. It's amazing that Hans stayed there until he was 21. I mean, imagine being in high school at 21 with classmates that were much younger than you. But he didn't feel that he had a choice. I mean, the king was paying his tuition, and his patron, Jonas Collins, was determined that he would stay and graduate. So eventually Colin did pull Hans out of school when he realized the extent of the mistreatment, but the young man's psyche was already quite damaged. He also had a kind of arrested development from being around teenagers every day and being treated like a teenager for so long, and he never fully grew up. So the Colin family provided him with financial support, but they also contributed to his wounds. He had a place at the family table, but he would never be their equal, and he knew it. Also at that family table was one of Jonas's sons, Edvard. And Edvard was one of Hans's first obsessions and probably the great love of his life. Edvard was practical, sensible, and unromantic in nature, the complete opposite of Hans, and their lifelong friendship would be strained many times by Hans's expectations. At one point, Hans turned his affections towards Edvard's sister Louisa, but she wasn't interested, and his attentions to her really seemed to be a reaction to Edvard's aloofness. So his feelings towards Edvard have often been debated by historians, with, of course, some saying, oh, it was normal for men to write very romantically to each other at the time. But the more popular opinion seems to be that Hans's letters to Edvard are most certainly love letters, and I would agree with that. In one letter, he wrote, "I languish for you as a pretty Calabrian wench. My sentiments for you are those of a woman. The femininity of my nature and our friendship must remain a mystery." Well, Edvard didn't feel the same way. Years later, he wrote in his memoir, "I found myself unable to respond to this love, and this caused the author much suffering." Edward got engaged to a woman named Henrietta, and Hans began to interfere in their lives in an attempt to destroy their relationship. He did fail to stop the marriage, but he did almost destroy his friendship with Edvard. There is an entirely plausible theory that The Little Mermaid was in fact a love letter to Edvard. Now, Hans fell in love countless times, but one of his more famous unrequited loves was for the great Swedish soprano Jenny Lind. You might know the name Jenny Lind from the movie The Greatest Showman, where she's portrayed as a temptress who causes P.T. Barnum to stray from his wife. Now, this is not based on reality at all, as Jenny Lind could barely tolerate P.T. Barnum, and the schedule he gave her caused her such performance burnout that she left show business to be a singing professor. It is true, however, that she was a megastar of her time, and she was one of the completely unobtainable women that Hans Christian Andersen would obsess over during his life. He wrote, "Through Jenny Lind, I first became sensible of the holiness there is in art. No books, no men have had a better or more ennobling influence on me as a poet. One of his most famous fairy tales, The Nightingale, was inspired by Lind, and she became known as the Swedish Nightingale for the rest of her career. In true Hans Christian Andersen style, he met her, fell in love immediately, and proposed a few weeks later. Now, of course, he was too shy to ask her outright, but he shoved a letter of proposal into her hand as she was boarding a train. Now, keep in mind that she was around 20 and he was around 40, and he was this guy that she'd just met a few weeks ago at a party and maybe spoken to for a few minutes, so she wasn't really that impressed. So she sent him a letter with what the young people today would call the ultimate friend zone. She wrote, "Farewell, God bless, and protect my brother, is the sincerest wish of his affectionate sister, Jenny." Well, he wasn't only a suffocating romantic interest, he was also a suffocating friend. Incidentally, Hans spent much of his life living with friends or in rented rooms, even after he became successful and financially stable enough to buy a house. He had this need to be an eternal house guest. Now, I don't know if it was part of his codependent nature or if poverty had traumatized him into always living as though he were homeless, but he just expected that he would be able to stay with his friends for long stretches of time. There was the time that he stayed with the famous author Charles Dickens, and he sucked the life right out of the family. So, Hans was a massive fanboy of Dickens. They did meet in 1847 and they did get along. I mean, they had a lot in common. They both experienced poverty as children. They were both child factory workers and they both had a past life in the theatre. So they got along, and Hans got to tell Charlie how much he loved his work and how great he was and how talented, and gush over him, and it was all good. So in the 9 years until they see each other again, Hans sends him regular fan mail, and Dickens is polite enough, and one day he sends a letter that has one of those "do stay with us next time you come to England," kind of throwaway comments that nobody really means. But Hans reads this and basically says, "Great, I'm on the next boat." Well, what he actually wrote was, "My visit is for you alone. Above all, always leave me a small corner of your heart." Now, this was the absolute worst time for the Dickens family to have a house guest. It was 1857 and Dickens had been rehearsing for a Wilkie Collins play. He was extremely stressed about his return to acting. Also, he'd been having an affair with his 18-year-old co-star. He'd been planning to leave his wife for her at about this time, but the planned visit of Hans Christian Andersen had to postpone that little plan. So it was basically really awkward, is what I'm saying. So, what made things even worse is the fact that Hans decided that the planned 2-week stay was actually going to be 5 weeks, which I'm sure Dickens was thrilled. The first unusual thing that Hans did was to announce that it was a Danish custom for a son of the family to shave the guest every morning. The eldest Dickens boy was like, no way, I'm not doing that. And Charles had to arrange for Hans to take the carriage to a barber's appointment every morning of his stay. Now, I have no idea whether it actually was Danish custom at that time or if Hans was just really spoiled by his friends, but the Dickens family was really creeped out over this. So, it's the opening night of the Wilkie Collins play that Dickens is starring in, and Queen Victoria is in the audience as well as a lot of other famous people, and our darling Hans becomes so emotional during Dickens's performance that his sobs are audible. After spending the show distracting everyone with his extra loud crying, Hans descended into a dark mood because he wasn't being recognized enough at the after party. He annoyed every single member of the Dickens household at all times, completely oblivious to their reactions. He loved to do crafting projects with paper, and as I saw in Brisbane, he was brilliant at cutting out patterns, but he always left a big mess of little paper bits all over the floor. He'd also pick flowers in the woods and make daisy chains. He annoyed Wilkie Collins by putting daisy chains all over his hat when he wasn't looking, and Collins had no idea why everyone was pointing and laughing at him as he was walking down the street. Now, those things I personally think are a little bit quirky and kind of cute and funny, but the house was really stressed out. And I'm sure Mrs. Dickens and the kids could sense that Charles had something going on. It would have been a really tense environment, and here's Hans annoying people with flowers. He also liked to make things just a bit dramatic. So during the visit, he read a negative review of something that he'd written, and instead of being a bit disappointed, he threw himself on the front lawn and sobbed hysterically in front of all the neighbours. He was so scared of pickpockets that if he felt even slightly uneasy in a cab, he would stuff the contents of his pockets into his boots, including scissors and penknives and books. Now, Hans may have been socially awkward and kind of selfish, but Dickens was outright unkind about him behind his back. He wrote to a friend that Andersen spoke French like Peter the Wild Boy and English like the deaf and dumb school. His translatress appears to make out he can't speak Danish either. That's a bit rough, Charles, don't you think? Hans wept copious tears on the day of his departure, but do you know who didn't cry? Everybody else. Dickens went straight to the guest room and wrote on the mirror, "Hans Andersen slept in this room for 5 weeks, which seemed to the family ages." The worst faux pas, however, happened when Hans got back to Denmark. Dickens had separated from his wife to great public scandal, and he was trying to salvage his reputation. Hans had written an account of his visit to England, and it said particularly wonderful things about Mrs. Dickens, and by the time the article was published in England, Dickens had already left. Well, for all of his problematic behaviour as a person, I love his work, and it's inspired me for as long as I can remember. sometimes the weirdest people are the greatest conduits of magical art, and that's just how it is. So I'm going to have some tea and finish this drawing, and I would love it if you could like, subscribe to the channel, and look up Obsession Podcast for a fuller analysis. And whatever you do, stay magical. Thanks for joining us.